My name is Leonardo da Vinci, and in 1610, I set out on one of my greatest discoveries yet. I saw this very peculiar object. I don't know quite what it was, I've never seen anything like it before. It had these big wheels and this big body. And then I saw it move. And it kept on moving. But eventually, something very peculiar happened. It was eventually stopped. And I don't know what it was, but I gave it a name. I gave it the name called friction that stopped that car from moving. But then, to prove my hypothesis and really discover more about friction, I decided to go back to my laboratory where I'd make a simulation of it.
Girl, we all know this is what you wanted, girl. So fall into friction, hold on to addiction, and never let go of your perfect affliction. The breakdowns apparent, get over you can. Apart with this right, I'll be counting the miles.
This is an example of static friction between the wooden block and the table. Now, see an example of static friction between the wood block and the table. After testing my great idea of friction, I discovered that there were actually two types of friction. One is called static friction, and another is called kinetic friction. Now, I set out and asked my fellow colleagues what they thought friction was.
Excuse me. Oh, hello! That's friction. It's when two things rub against each other and create heat. Can you give me an example, please? Like, two ice blocks against each other and you slide them. Welcome.
Michelle, what's friction?
What is friction?
Isn't that a post-punk band from the 80s?
What is friction?
I don't know.
Do you know what friction is? Isn't it when things rub together?
What's friction? Guys, what's friction, freshmen? Hi, Ryan. What's friction? What is friction?
I take AP Bio, not physics. It makes fire.
Putty, what do you think of friction? Oh, very nice.
What is friction?
Friction is things rubbing together.
Do you know the difference between static and kinetic friction?
No.
What is friction? Well, if only we knew. No, really. Friction. Two things trying to slide against each other. It's a force that resists the sliding. So, more friction, more resistance to sliding.
And the difference between static and kinetic friction?
Static friction is when the two things aren't yet sliding. So if you're trying to get your sofa moving across the carpet and it hasn't moved yet, you're fighting static friction. But once it starts sliding, you're now fighting kinetic friction, which is a little less.
For many days, I labored over my calculations. And it turns out, the guy I interviewed called Mr. Pearson, he was right. Friction is the force resisting the lateral motion of two solid surfaces. And for static friction and kinetic friction, there are two different coefficients in the equations that I calculated. And the coefficient for static friction is going to be greater than the coefficient for kinetic friction. Now I'm going to walk you through some of the calculations that I did. To find the coefficient of friction in the system, you want to look at the system as a whole. So that the total amount of friction in the system equals the total amount of mass times the total amount of acceleration. To find the total amount of force in the system, you find the forces that are acting on the system and subtract them. One is the force of gravity, and another is the force of friction.
Girl, we all know